Now before we get into render settings, I want to make something to render. So I'll probably just make a teapot in the top view here. You can make whatever, it really doesn't matter. Hit Z to zoom extents. Now we're going to get into the render scene dialog box. That's basically where we change our render settings. We can do that the hard way by going to the toolbar and scrolling. Even farther beyond the material editor is this render scene dialog button. I don't think I've ever pushed that button in my entire life. I always use the keyboard shortcut F10. Now I realize that F10 might be a little hard to remember, but folks, you use this dialog box all the time. Maybe get a tattoo on the back of your hand if you need to, but remember this shortcut. Now there is obviously a lot here. And for this segment, we're just going to skim over the Common tab. These are the features and functions that you will be using the most. Probably most important is time output. By default, it's set to single. So that way, when we hit F9, we render just a still image. However, if we were to select active time element, it would attempt to render the entire timeline. You could render pieces of the timeline by selecting a range. Let's say I want frames 75 to 100. Hit enter there, or just hit some other field, and it will only render 75 to 100. You could also render every nth frame, so maybe every fifth frame you want to render. So you just maybe want a basic idea of what it looks like. Down here under output size, there's some standards here. If you're doing television in North America, you'll probably want to use one of the NTSC standards. If you're doing television in Europe, most likely you'll want to use one of the PAL or PAL standards. There's also an HDTV standard, some slide standards, and also some film presets as well. I'm going to click out of here, select custom. There's also some standard sizes here. Just hit a button and you'll see that my width and height automatically update to reflect the button that I've just selected. Of course, you can change that manually. Go over here with the spinner and adjust that. What's really cool too is that you could lock down the image aspect ratio, and then as you move your width, your height will adjust accordingly so that the width and height of your render stay proportionate. Now, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but it's good to know that pixels on your monitor have a square aspect ratio, means they're as wide as they are tall. Pixels on a television set do not have square pixels. Now, again, this is a little bit more sophisticated than we have time to discuss here fully, but suffice it to say, there's a couple standards here, and I'll give you these numbers and you could write them down. Pixel aspect ratio of 1 is good for on-screen display. If you're doing something for the web or something else that will be viewed on a computer monitor, leave that set to 1. If you're doing standard full-screen television, change that to 0.9. If you're doing widescreen television stuff, change that to 1.2. Let's scroll down here a little bit. Now this render output area is extremely important. If you want to save your file and have the most control over its output, you want to hit this Files button. Select Files, and I could name this whatever I would like to. And then it says Save as Type. Well, here are the formats you can save to from 3ds Max. You could save to AVI, you could save to still image formats, QuickTime movies, etc., etc., etc. Now, one thing you need to be aware of is that a lot of newbies instantly go and render to video. Now, some of the most expert users in the world do the same thing. But sometimes, actually very often, you might want to render to a series of images called a sequence. The standard for that in the 3D world is Targa. More often than not, when I output from 3ds Max, I'm outputting a series of Targa files, or a Targa sequence. So a question you might ask is, well, if you're rendering animation, why would you want to do a series of still images? Well, when we're dealing with really robust scenes, maybe you have fire spewing out of a dragon who's wagging his tail and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And Max is actually a pretty unstable program. We've talked about saving in increments and about how Max files often get corrupted. And, poor Max, it has a lot to do. And oftentimes when it's rendering, it will crash. So if you're rendering out a movie, and let's say it takes you 100 hours to render out that movie segment. If it crashes in the 99th hour, you've lost 99 hours of work. If in that same project you would have rendered to a series of still images, then the only thing that you would have to re-render is that one image file that it crashed on. Another cool thing about Targa files is that they can contain transparency, or an alpha channel in other words. But it's a little hidden how to get it to do that. I'm going to select the Targa image file, and I'm going to select something for the name. Doesn't matter, I'm not going to really save this. Hit save. It doesn't actually save anything yet. We get to the Targa image control dialog box. Now, mine automatically said 32. Yours might say 24. This refers to the total bit depth of the image. If you want it to have an alpha channel, you need to save it as a 32-bit image. Then we can hit OK. And then once we render, it will render our movie file if we have a movie here. Also be aware, and this is kind of frustrating sometimes, that the viewport selected here at the bottom of the render scene dialog is the one that will get rendered. If you have a really sweet camera and it's all moving around, you might be very disappointed that your final render is rendered from the top view. So make sure that you change this to select the viewport that you want to render. If you're worried about making the mistake that I just mentioned and accidentally rendering the wrong view, you can hit this padlock. You see, typically, as you click on different views to select them, you'll notice that the viewport name changes here. So if I were to open this render scene dialog box or render with the front view selected, it's going to automatically assume that that's the view that I want to render. If we select the viewport we really want it to render and then just lock it down, then no matter which viewport we select, it will not be changed here. Kind of a good way to dummy proof it. Now another thing that's important is this rendered frame window. Basically, when we hit F9 and bring up a render here, it brings up this rendered frame window. Well, if you're doing a production quality render, maybe you're rendering an animation or something, it's actually going to slow down your render considerably to have to visually show you what it's doing as it renders. So as I'm playing around in Max, I always have this checked, but as I'm ready to do my final render, I always have it unchecked. And that's the essentials of the scanline rendering controls. And you might ask, well, what does scanline mean? Well, if we go into the assign renderer area here, we select what our rendering engine is right here. As we click this dialog box, we'll see that we also have the opportunity to select the mental ray renderer or the view file renderer. We'll be talking about the mental ray renderer a little bit later, but the name of the default rendering engine in 3ds Max is the scanline renderer. And now you know the basics, so good for you. Now let's move along and talk about the rendering environment, another really crucial element in rendering.